HOA Karen called cops when my family refused her rules. Too bad we're all lawyers. We had finally made it. After years of working long hours, juggling courtrooms, and raising kids, my parents had purchased their dream home in a quiet, upscale neighborhood. It was peaceful, clean, and nestled behind white fences and manicured lawns. My mother, a brilliant civil rights lawyer, smiled as she placed a small sunflower wreath on the front door. My father, always calm and composed, wheeled out a grill for the backyard, excited for our first family BBQ on the new patio. My sister, fresh from passing the bar exam, was practically glowing. And I'd been a defense attorney. For nearly 10 years, we knew what we were doing. We had every document signed, every agreement reviewed. Nothing could spoil this moment. Or so we thought. It didn't take long for the storm to show up. On our second day, while unloading the last of our moving boxes, a woman strutted toward us with a clipboard in one hand and a judgmental glare in the other. She introduced herself unprompted as Karen, president of the Homeowners Association. "You'll need to remove that decoration," she said, pointing at the sunflower wreath. "It doesn't align with our aesthetic guidelines." My mother paused, then replied with practiced grace, "We'll be happy to review the HOA agreement before making any changes." Karen's lips curled into a tight smile. "That's not how this works. You don't get to pick and choose here." Her voice dripped with entitlement. She glanced around at our cars, our patio furniture, even the potted plants we had lined up neatly by the driveway. "We like to keep the neighborhood uniform," she added. It was clear she hadn't come to welcome us. She had come to make a statement. We chose not to engage further. Instead, we reviewed the HOA bylaws as promised. Everything Karen had mentioned. The wreath, the plants were well within regulation. We let it go, thinking maybe she was just overzealous. But over the next week, we received 3 separate violation notices. First, for having lawn chairs on the front porch. Then, for parking one of our cars too close to the curb, even though it was within the lines. And the third, most ridiculous of all, for leaving a child's toy, a small rubber football, on the grass during the afternoon. Each notice was worded harshly and sent via email and printed letter. Each time, we responded with formal rebuttals, citing the exact clause in the HOA rules that proved her claims invalid. But Karen wasn't used to being challenged. You could sense her frustration growing with each respectful legal reply we gave. This wasn't a family she could intimidate with scare tactics. And while we had no intention of starting a war, we also had no intention of rolling over. If Karen wanted to play games, she was going to learn that we came prepared. It was a warm Saturday afternoon when we decided to host a small BBQ in our backyard. Nothing outrageous, just close family, a grill, a few foldable chairs, and soft jazz playing through the outdoor speakers. The sun was still up, and we were well within the HOA's noise ordinance and event hours. More importantly, we were celebrating something special. My sister had just won her first case in court. After years of studying, interning, and grinding through law school, she had taken on a pro bono case and crushed it. Pride filled the air as much as the scent of grilled ribs. My parents beamed with joy. My wife was laughing with my sister, and even the neighbors 2 houses down waved as they passed. It felt like our first real moment of peace since moving in. That peace didn't last long. Karen showed up just as we were serving plates. She marched across the yard like she owned the entire block. Arms crossed, eyes narrow, lips tight. "This is an unauthorized gathering," she said, not even bothering with a greeting. "You didn't get approval from the HOA." Her voice was loud enough to make the entire yard go quiet. "Disperse now, or I'll call the police." My father wiped his hands calmly with a napkin and stood up. "You're welcome to call," he said with a cool smile. "We'll wait right here." Karen scoffed, pulled out her phone, and began dialing, her eyes never leaving us, as if daring someone to challenge her. No one did. We just went back to eating. About 15 minutes later, 2 police cruisers pulled up. The officers stepped out slowly, clearly unsure what to expect. Karen greeted them in full performance mode. "They've been aggressive, loud, and completely defiant," she exclaimed. "This is a violation of HOA rules, and they've refused multiple warnings." One of the officers approached, his hand resting on his belt. That's when I stepped forward, reaching into my pocket and showing him my ID and bar card. "A licensed defense attorney," I said. "That's my wife. She's a civil rights attorney. And over there," I gestured toward my sister, "is a constitutional law professor." The other officer blinked in surprise, Gren still trying. "To maintain control," interjected, "that doesn't matter. This is against the rules." The officer glanced back at her, then at the calm, orderly gathering behind me. He asked, "Is this a legal, private event?" "Yes," I replied. "No laws have been broken. We followed all HOA regulations. As documented in the bylaws," he sighed, clearly annoyed to be pulled into what now felt like a personal grudge. "All right," he said. "You folks have a good evening." They left, and Karen stood there, humiliated, her face flushed with a mix of frustration and disbelief. "You think you're above the rules?" she snapped. I looked at her without flinching. "No," I said. "But we know the rules better than you do." She didn't respond, just turned around stiffly and stormed off down the sidewalk, muttering something about the HOA board. We knew this wasn't over. But now she knew she had picked a fight with the wrong family. It didn't take long for Karen to escalate her efforts. A week after the BBQ incident, we received notice of an emergency HOA meeting. Karen had called for a formal hearing, accusing our family of aggressive conduct, failure to comply, and deliberate disruption of community standards. It was laughable, but we showed up nonetheless prepared and composed. The meeting took place in the community clubhouse. The board members sat in a half circle, papers in hand, while Karen stood at the front, pointing fingers and reading from a list of invented violations. Her voice was sharp, full of certainty, as she demanded that we be fined, warned, and formally disciplined. She even implied that we were trying to intimidate the neighborhood through legal bullying. When she finally stepped aside, the room fell silent, all eyes shifting to my mother as she stood up. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't point fingers. She simply opened a binder and began to speak. Calmly and clearly she walked the board through each accusation, refuting them one by one. She quoted HOA bylaws, cited local housing ordinances, and referenced federal anti-discrimination statutes. Then she did something none of them expected. She turned the spotlight on Karen. "What you are witnessing," my mother said, "is not an isolated conflict. It's part of a pattern, one that violates the Fair Housing Act." She listed several occasions where Karen had acted outside the limits of her authority, issuing biased citations, forcing unenforceable rules, and failing to apply HOA standards equally across homeowners. The room was still. One board member cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. Another looked down at his notes. Karen, flushed and wide-eyed, exploded. "They're twisting the law. They're manipulating the board with legal jargon." But no one backed her up. Not this time. That night we went a step further, started talking to our neighbors, especially the ones who, like us, had darker skin and unfamiliar last names. What we found was alarming. Karen had cited the same people over and over for petty infractions: garden flags, music volume, fence colors, while letting others slide for worse. One Latino family had been fined 5 times in a single month. A Pakistani couple shared screenshots of aggressive late-night texts from Karen about parking. A young interracial couple described how Karen once photographed their yard and sent them a warning letter the next day. It was a clear pattern, and we now had proof. We compiled every complaint, every photo, every violation letter. And then we filed an official legal complaint with both the city's housing department and the state's Fair Housing Commission. Karen had crossed more than one line, and this time, we weren't just defending ourselves, we were standing up for the entire community. Weeks later, the first letter arrived. Karen was now under formal investigation. The HOA board received notification as well. You could feel the panic spreading. One board member stepped down immediately, muttering, "I didn't sign up for lawsuits." The rest began distancing themselves, no longer responding to Karen's emails or backing her decisions. For the first time since we moved in, Karen didn't show her face on our street. Maybe she finally realized this wasn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore. This was legal, and it was far bigger than she ever imagined. The courtroom was quiet, heavy with tension. As Karen stood on the other side of the aisle alone, clutching a stack of disorganized papers and looking far less confident than she had in our backyard weeks ago. She had refused legal representation, insisting she could handle the case herself. After all, she'd spent years bossing around neighbors and issuing citations like royal decrees. How different could a courtroom really be? But now, under the fluorescent lights and the watchful gaze of a seasoned judge, her bravado began to crack. She opened with a shaky statement, claiming we had bullied the HOA, misused our legal knowledge, and created an unsafe environment in the neighborhood. Her tone was defensive, emotional, and wildly inconsistent with the facts. Then, it was our turn. My sister, barely a year into her law career, stood up and addressed the court with quiet authority. She moved through her points with precision, presenting emails, violation letters, timeline records, and even HOA board minutes that exposed Karen's personal targeting. Every claim Karen had made was either exaggerated, misrepresented, or completely baseless. My sister cited civil rights cases and local housing laws, drawing clear lines between Karen's actions and legal discrimination. The judge listened intently, interrupting only once to ask Karen why certain violations only seemed to be enforced against homeowners of color. Karen stammered something about community standards, but the damage was already done. The contradiction was obvious, and the judge didn't hide his disapproval. After closing arguments, the judge took only a short recess before returning with the verdict. The court found Karen and, by extension, the HOA guilty of unlawful enforcement, racial discrimination, and failure to follow due process. The judgment was clear and firm. Not only were we awarded financial damages for emotional distress and legal fees, but Karen was immediately removed from her position as HOA President. The remaining board members were ordered to attend anti-discrimination training, and the HOA itself would be subject to state oversight for the next 12 months. Karen's face was blank as the ruling was read, but her eyes flickered with disbelief. This neighborhood, once her little kingdom, had become a courtroom stage for her own downfall. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood began to shift. People we hadn't spoken to came by to apologize. Some had felt too intimidated to speak up before. Others simply hadn't known the extent of what was happening. One neighbor brought us a pie and said, "We should have stood with you sooner." Karen's house went up for sale shortly after the ruling. No farewell notes. No goodbyes. Just a quiet moving truck and a for sale sign hammered into the grass she used to obsess over. Looking back, we never came to this neighborhood looking for conflict, just wanted peace, a safe place to call home. But when someone uses power to intimidate, exclude, or control through fear, there comes a time to stand firm. We didn't want a war. But if you challenge a family of lawyers with lies and fear, you'd better come prepared for court. For more powerful stories like this, subscribe to Story Tier.